So let me start the introduction. So again, it's Living Glass, Active Matter at High Densities by Professor Chandan Dasgupta. Professor Dasgupta did doctoral research at the University of Pennsylvania, finishing his PhD in 1978. He did his postdoctoral work with Shankeng Ma at the University of California at San Diego between 78 and 80, and with Bert Halperin at Harvard from 80 to 81. And then he taught at the University of Minnesota for some time. I was a postdoc there, and Chandan had just left when I joined, so I was very disappointed at the time. Minneapolis, after a few years in Minneapolis, he returned to India. He joined Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore in 1987. He holds the position of honorary emeritus professor there, along with the Distinguished Fellowship of the Science and Engineering Research Board, India, after retiring in 2017. He also holds the position of Simons Visiting Professor at the International Center for Theoretical Sciences in Bangalore. Professor Dasgupta's area of research is condensed matter physics, with emphasis on statistical mechanics and dynamics. He has made important contributions in the theory of phase transitions, statistical mechanics of disordered systems, dynamics of supercooled liquids near the glass transition, and properties of strongly confined liquids. His awards include Fellowship of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Sir C.V. Raman Award for Research in Physical Sciences, the Satyendranath Bose Medal, and the J.C. Bose National Fellowship. His memberships include all 3 science academies in India and the World Academy of Sciences. And by the way, I think, Chandan, you missed some of your prizes, but I will not take up any more of your time. So with that, it's over to you. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Surajit, very much for the invitation to give this Zoom talk, and also for the kind introduction. So as he just mentioned, today's seminar is going to be about active matter at high densities, which I call living glass. So I'll just start with this. Some people do at the end, but I like to do that at the beginning. The people that who have contributed a great deal to the results that I'll be talking about today. So these are mostly, well, many of them are actually students at IISc. They were ex-students. And we also have a collaboration with Nirgov at Weizmann Institute, and also Bulbul Chakraborty at Brandeis. So among these people, I'd just like to sort of specially mention 2. One is Rituparna Mondal, who has been involved in all the things that I'll be talking about today, and also Madan Rao, who has played a very important role in sort of selecting these problems, and also in all aspects of our work. There are a few papers that I have listed here. I'll also be referring to these papers in different parts of the talk. It also mentioned that one sort of issue with Zoom meetings is that questions can become, it's difficult to ask questions. So I'd like to find out how this is to be done. I mean, you are going to send questions to Surajit by chat, and then he will ask, or you can just interrupt me.
I think it is better to interrupt, because it is a small group, and that way it is more spontaneous.
Yeah. So
if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's okay. I welcome that.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is the usual outline. I'll first introduce the problem, and then some experimental results that basically motivate our work in this direction. We'll talk about some models, and results will be both mostly numerical, but also there are several analytic results also that I'll try to discuss. And then, of course, at the end, some conclusions. So first, introduction, I'll mention active matter. I mean, this is something that probably doesn't really need an introduction these days, because in the last 10-15 years, this has become a very important area of research in statistical mechanics and dynamics. So the introduction will be brief. What we are looking at is basically collections of self-propelled objects. I'll call an object self-propelled if it has some source of either ambient energy or some stored energy in itself. And this energy, it can convert into systematic motion. So it can move by itself, so to speak. And there are many examples of this such systems now. Many of them are examples are from biology, going from let's say microscopic level where you look at motor proteins in cells, to mesoscopic level where you look at motion of bacteria, collective motion of bacteria, or even in the macroscopic scale where you see things around you, like flocks of birds and schools of fish and things like that. The main interest in this subject is that many of these collections of self-propelled objects exhibit very interesting collective behavior. And this collective behavior, as you can see here in the simple pictures, I mean, the bacteria or the fish or the birds, they're sort of moving together in some sense. And this sort of simple examples of such collective behavior. And this collective behavior is out of equilibrium, in the sense that there is now some external source of energy, in the sense that in addition to the energy associated with the interactions among these self-propelled objects, they have internal or ambient source of energy. So there is injection of energy, and as a result, the system basically falls out of equilibrium. So to understand this non-equilibrium collective behavior, one has to basically then go into non-equilibrium statistical physics to be able to understand what is going on. I am sure you have also seen many movies and things like that of this. So let me just try one or two. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time showing these movies. I hope this will show. You can see it all right. I mean, this bacteria, E. coli bacterials that are exhibiting what is known as this swarming motion, where there is no fixed direction of motion, but you see that bunches of bacteria, they are moving together. So there is certainly some cooperativity, and then one wants to understand how this cooperativity arises, and also how to characterize that, and so on and so forth. There are sort of more dramatic examples. This is flocking of birds, and as you can see, a huge number of birds, but their movements are highly correlated. They're all moving together. And so then one wants to understand what is the mechanism for the formation of this flocking that you can see. So the movies were showing, Shrujit?
Yes, they were. Yeah, very nicely.
So what we are going to be interested in is that systems of such objects, self-propelled objects or active particles, but specifically we'll be interested in the high density limit, where these active objects are very close to each other. And then what we want to find out is whether they exhibit glossy behavior. So that is going to be the main topic of this seminar, the glossy behavior in collections of active particles. Before going it, yes.
And these particles are interacting with each other?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So the interactions play this important role, that this collective behavior arises from the interactions.
Fine.
So before going into that, I think it's useful to have a few slides on what I mean by glossy behavior. I mean, again, the glass transition problem, of course, is one of the sort of classic problems in statistical physics, and people have been working on it for more than 100 years. And so I hope you are somewhat familiar with what we are going to talk about, but just a few elementary things that I like to mention, and those things will become important as we go along. So we are talking about glossy behavior, and the standard phenomenology is that you start with this temperature, and this is some, let's say, specific volume. Start with high temperature when the system is in liquid, and then you reduce the temperature, and depends on how fast you are cooling. If you cool it sufficiently fast so that equilibrium is maintained at all times, then the system basically, typically simple systems, will crystallize at a temperature which I call this Tm. But then you can bypass this crystallization process by cooling the system fast, so that it sort of the crystal doesn't nucleate, and then you basically end up even temperatures below Tm in a state where the system is in a liquid. This is called the supercooled liquid. And then if you continue to cool this supercooled liquid to lower number temperatures, eventually this liquid basically becomes something that looks like a solid, which I'll call glass. But this solid is very different from the crystal, in the sense that this glossy solid doesn't have basically the crystalline order that you associate with the crystalline solid state. So we'll be interested in some sense, this particular part. where the system is the supercooled liquid, and it is approaching the formation of glass. And in this regime, we'll be interested in, or most people in the theory of glasses are interested in trying to understand what the dynamics is, which exhibits very interesting features, which I want to show in the next slide. Again, what we are the basic sort of important feature of this approach to the glass transition is that this time scale of structural relaxation increases rapidly as one is approaching the glass transition, as one is reducing the temperature. And as you can see here, one is plotting the viscosity in poise in a log scale in the y-axis, and Tg over T, where Tg is a reference glass transition temperature. And so, I mean, as you reduce T, then one is going in the positive x direction. And as you can see here, the viscosity is increasing by like 10 or 12 orders of magnitude over a pretty much small range of this temperature. And the growth of the viscosity or growth of the relaxation time, different systems have different kinds of characteristics. And in particular, there is this distinction between fragile glass and strong glass. The fragile glass is one that shows this strong curvature in this plot, and the strong glass is more or less linear. Linear basically means that the log of the viscosity is proportional to 1 over temperature. So that is the usual Arrhenius form. So strong glasses exhibit Arrhenius growth, whereas fragile glasses exhibit faster than Arrhenius growth. And we'll be interested in basically this kind of dynamics and try to find out, for example, if I instead of looking at, let's say, the standard systems, if we now look at active systems, then whether again one has a similar behavior or something else and whatnot. So to analyze that, one has to have some description of these lines that are drawn through these data points. This line, as I said, is simple Arrhenius dependence, but this line with a lot of curvature for fragile systems, one has something which is known as this Vogel-Fruchtet-Tamand form, which produces a pretty good description of how the relaxation time or the viscosity, things like that, how they grow as one reduces the temperature. So this form is pretty simple. T is the temperature, and this is the variable that we are looking at, viscosity or relaxation time. And as you can see here, there is a special temperature, which I'll call TVFT, at which this relaxation time is supposed to diverge. So that is the ideal glass transition, and one is interested in basically what causes that kind of a transition and why this particular form of the dependence of the relaxation time on temperature provides a good description of the behavior of fragile liquids. And there is a parameter here which I'll refer to later on, this kappa, which tells us about the rate at which this tau alpha grows as you are reducing the temperature. And Austin Angel, he coined this term fragility. So, I mean, different glass forming liquids are then classified. Of course, this TVFT is also going to change as I go from one system to another, but this fragility also changes. And so both of these quantities are of interest. So this is a very brief introduction to the phenomenology of the glass transition. We are going to be interested in similar behavior in active systems. So the question is, why are we interested in active systems? This particular aspect of the behavior of the active systems. So that is our motivation, basically. The main reason, I mean, I have been working in this field for about maybe 4 or 5 years, and I got interested in this because my colleague Madan Rao, he brought to our attention many phenomena in biology which show this kind of dynamics, glassy dynamics. And I've just given you some examples here, the bacterial cytoplasm, then if you have molecular motors and then cytoskeleton, this complex. And many more recently, I mean, there have been a lot of experiments on this cell layers, epithelial cell layers, which are studied in many different contexts. The formation, I mean, the growth of an embryo, embryogenesis, then wound healing, various disease, asthma and cancer cells, metastasis and things like that. There are lots of experiments on these cell layers and also this 2 other things, which show behavior similar to what I was discussing. So what is this behavior? Is that the dynamics becomes very slow as you change some parameter. In these systems, the temperature is not the control parameter. In many cases, one basically changes the density. And in ordinary glasses also, one can change the density and show and see similar behavior, that as we increase the density, then the system becomes more and more sluggish, and eventually it becomes a glass. So similar phenomenology is seen in many of these biological systems. And that is one of the reasons why many people are now interested in this particular problem. And at the same time, experimentalists, they are also trying to sort of come up with artificial active matter. And in the high density limit, now experiments are being performed in systems where this artificial active matter consisting of, let's say, Janus colloids or granular systems under vibration, these are being studied at high densities. And again, many of the phenomenology that one associates with supercooled liquids near the glass transition are observed in these systems. So these are the sort of experimental motivation for trying to understand what happens to.
And then
Yes.
I will interrupt you. So you are talking about like this observation of this behavior of glasses near transition temperature only in the active matter, or you are talking about all kind of glassy behavior in active matter? I mean,
we are particularly interested in high density limit, and there we are interested in the slow dynamics and how this dynamics depends on the control parameters. We are not interested in the dilute limit, where again active matter shows many other interesting properties.
also
So those will not be.
You are not including low temperature properties of glasses, right? Where you have seen a lot of universalities.
No, that we are not talking about here. I mean, in ordinary glasses, if we go to low temperatures, again, there are these two-level systems and many other interesting things going on, which, at least in this project, we have not looked at in the context of active matter. So it's a liquid state, and then how the liquid becomes more and more sluggish, and eventually it becomes basically amorphous solid. That kind of observations in the context of active matter that we'll be interested in. Okay.
Yes.
So let me show a couple of examples of this biological active matter, which shows glassy behavior. As I said, the bacterial cytoplasm has glass-like properties. This paper that came out in Cell a few years ago. And what they do is they looked at tracer diffusion inside a cell, and ordinary metabolic, when the cell has metabolic activity, then the tracer basically goes through the whole volume. As you can see here, these are the tracer paths, and it goes through the whole, explores the whole cell. But then as this quantity called DNP, some chemical is added that stops metabolic activity, then the tracer doesn't diffuse anymore. And you can see here, the tracer is basically undergoing what is known as cage motion, in the sense that it's just vibrating about some equilibrium position with a small amplitude. So, and this is also seen in the mean square displacement as a function of time. When the tracer is basically moving around, mean square displacement increases as a function of time, and eventually saturates because it's diffusing in a finite system. But there is, one can understand this by diffusion. This dependence on time one can understand from diffusion. But when this DNP is added, then it doesn't go anywhere. It basically, there's a very small value of the mean square displacement, which doesn't increase as a function of time. So this is similar to a glass transition, as one is turning off the metabolic activity. And that is what it says, that the activity basically fluidizes the system. When there is no activity, then the system, then these particles will not diffuse, and the medium will behave like a glass. Then I mentioned epithelial cells, and here is an example where actually, again, cells being sort of mesoscopic objects, one can image them, and one can basically look at a layer of cell and its dynamics. So let's just see if this movie plays. So you can see here the cells are moving around quite fast. As time progresses, the motion becomes slower and slower, and eventually at relatively long times, and this is long times, several hours or maybe hundreds of hours, then it basically looks like as if it is not moving at all. So this is basically the transition from a liquid to a glass, in the sense that one is starting with the usual liquid, and then as a function of time, one is getting into a state in which the cells are basically stuck. And the biophysics of the thing tells us that as time increases, what is happening is that cell adhesion is increasing, and that is driving a transition from the initial liquid state to a final glassy state. As some parameter, here it is the cell adhesion, which is being valued. So these are the kind of phenomena that we'll be interested in, that you have a liquid and then some parameter is changed and the dynamics becomes very, very slow, and then it continues to slow down as this parameter is changed further, and eventually it ends into an arrested state, which you can call a glossy state or a jammed state or something like that. So these are examples taken from biology. As I said, not this one. People are now experimenting with artificial active matter, and this is an experiment which was done in France and came out very recently, where they're looking at what is known as Janus colloids. And here, if you I don't know if you can see it in the experimental setup, you have these little circles, and half of it is colored in one way and half of it is colored in a different way. So what they do is that coat half of each part many similar properties.
Okay. Okay.
And we'll see that. I mean, if I can go till the end of my talk, we've also talked about some jamming in the context of active matter. Okay. And then one of the things that we are now trying to understand is that how that active jammed state is different from ordinary jammed states. So this question that you had asked is also an interesting question, and people are looking at it.
No, I was asking because I'm working on it. That's why. So.
Okay, good. So we can discuss later on. So shall I start? Go back to the presentation?
Yeah, let's hope for the better. I tried to reset a few things, but I'm not sure how much good it did, but we'll see.
We'll see, yeah. I mean, these are unexpected things.
Yeah,
yes.
It's first time actually in 1 year almost.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so let's get started.
Yeah. Screen, mail, PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And now I'll do here. Yeah, so I think I was here, right? I mean, we are talking about this
Yes.
Janus colloids, and where the fact that one side is coated with some metal that produces, when you put that in hydrogen peroxide, that produces some motion by itself, which makes them active or self-propelled. And the strength of the active force can be changed by changing the concentration of hydrogen peroxide. So there are, again, it's basically mean square displacement versus time that they get from this experiment. And as we go up, basically the active force is being increased. So you see here at the bottom, mean square displacement basically becomes like a plateau. So that is either very sluggish liquid or it could be a glass. But then as you increase the strength of self-propulsion, eventually at long times, you get this behavior, diffusive behavior. So again, this is basically an example, experimental example of glass is being melted because of the strength of the activity is increased. So this is sort of artificial active matter, but I mean the same phenomenology can be seen here also. And then one can have a phase diagram and things like that. Let me not, since we're already delayed a little bit, let me just skip this. But the point is, as you increase activity, glass, which was something which was glass in a passive limit, that can melt and become a liquid. And that is seen in many biological experiments and also in this sort of artificial active matter experiments. So these are now this brings me to the questions that we try to address. Activity fluidized a soft glassy system, phase diagram that I just mentioned. Then how does the structure? Is there any structural change due to activity or the dynamics in the supercooled state as one approaches the glass transition? Is that dynamics is different in active systems as compared to passive systems? These are the things that we try to understand. So to do that, I mean, we have to have models, and models are very simple. Models are basically a collection of particles, and here I have shown particles by two colors because typically one works with a binary mixture to avoid crystallization. So you have this, and it's dense. That's where all this phenomenology can be seen. And these arrows basically denote the directions of the active forces. So to specify microscopically the system, we have to first of all tell you about the interactions among the particles, and then the property of this active force. And the active force, basically, the simple models will be characterized by two parameters. One is the typical value of this force, and this active force itself has its dynamics, and it changes direction. So there is a persistence time associated with this direction of this active force. So these are the two parameters that we'll use to characterize the activity. And then other things are similar to what you have in a passive system. You have to specify temperature, you have to specify density, and you have to specify the interactions among the particles. So this is what we're going to do. We consider two different models of activity. One is called run and tumble, in which the force remains constant for a time tau, and then it is randomized. So it runs basically for some time tau, and then it tumbles, and the force then points in some other direction. And then there's another model, which is called active Brownian particles, where again the force direction magnitude is kept constant, but its direction, instead of here, this change happens discretely after time tau, but here the direction itself changes continuously, undergoing some kind of a rotational diffusion, and this rotational diffusion gives you a time scale. So these are the two parameters. One is the typical magnitude of the active force, and the other is basically the time scale, which tells us about how long the active force keeps on pointing in a particular direction. So and we'll vary these two things as we study the various models. So I will tell you about two different limits. The first one is a limit where the persistence time is short compared to other relevant time scales in the system. And there we look at, again, a model which has been studied a great deal in the context of passive classes. This is called the Cope-Anderson model. And I will not go into the details. It's just basically a few things that you need to know. Is that this is a binary mixture. It's not a single component system, so that it can be maintained in a supercooled liquid state for a long time. Otherwise, the liquid basically crystallizes. Interactions are the usual Lennard-Jones interactions. And I'm not going to tell you about exactly what the epsilon and sigma parameters are, but they're chosen in such a way that earlier simulations have shown that this system can be maintained in a supercooled state for a long time, so that one can basically study the dynamics in that state. And then the first thing that we did was basically a simulation. We did either molecular dynamics simulation or Langevin simulation. In both cases, we get essentially the same things. So again, I'll skip the details of the simulation. It's basically looking at the dynamics of the system once you specify all the parameters. So this is a very sketch of the system that we are looking at. The green particles are A-type particles and the red are B-type particles. We have a binary mixture. And in the first model that we did, we give activity only to the B-type particles. So then one can basically simulate the collective behavior of the system at different temperatures. Keep the density fixed at a high value and change the temperature. And then I have to say something about how you introduce the activity. As I said, the activity is only for B-type particles. And the model that we have here is similar to the run and tumble, where the direction of the propulsion force remains fixed for some time t, and then the directions are all randomized. And then we also make sure that there is no center of mass motion by making sure that the net sum of all the self-propulsion forces is 0 at all times. So again, these are the two parameters, the strength of the force, and tau is the time over which the force continues to point in a particular direction. And then after this time tau, the directions are randomized. So I'll show you some, many things can be measured, but I'll show you some data which shows the specific behavior that we are interested in. Again, we are doing this mean square displacement versus time, that it tells us about whether the particles are diffusing or not. And this F0 is the strength of the active force. And F0 equals 0 is basically the passive limit. So in the passive limit, this is the lowest curve. You can see that the mean square displacement increases initially, but then it levels off, and it basically this is this caging that is mentioned in the context of the glass transition. So the system was basically a glass at this temperature in the passive limit. But then you increase the activity, and then these curves move in this direction. And then you can see that beyond a certain value of the activity, you begin to see this diffusive regime where the mean square displacement increases as a function of time in a linear fashion. So this is the fluidization. Increasing activity fluidizes the glassy state. It's similar to the experiment and also to some of these biological systems that we had mentioned earlier. One can measure various quantities. One can measure the diffusion coefficient from this, or by looking at some kind of a time-dependent correlation function, one can measure the time scale, relaxation time. And as you can see here, for the passive system doesn't relax at all. I mean, this correlation function basically remains fixed at 1, but then it begins to decay as one increases the activity, and then one can see how the relaxation time is changing as a function of activity. So this is shown here. This is shown the diffusion constant as a function of temperature. This shows the relaxation time as a constant of temperature for different levels of activity. For zero activity, this is this curve or that curve. As you can see, the diffusion constant is dropping very, very fast, and it will go to zero eventually as you go to lower temperatures. Or relaxation time is increasing, and it will increase according to this. So we fit this relaxation time, for example, to this Vogel-Fulcher form, which predicts a divergence at a temperature TVFT. So by fitting this to this particular form, we can get this TVFT, the ideal glass transition temperature. And also you can get this parameter kappa called the fragility parameter. So we can also do similar fits to the diffusion constant, and then you can extract similar parameters. So it just says that, as you can see from here, as I'm going from here to there, to there, to there, to there, the growth of the relaxation time is quite rapid when there is no activity. But then as you turn on the activity, the dynamics becomes faster, and eventually it becomes very weakly temperature dependent as you go to sufficiently large activity. So here, the liquid is going to freeze. One is going to see a glass transition, but here, the liquid is not going to freeze at any finite temperature, and you don't get a glass transition temperature. Same thing from the diffusion. So from this, one can get some kind of phase diagram. Here is temperature, and here is the strength of the activity. So at when there is no activity in the passive system, there is a glass transition temperature, which is like 0.3 in reduced units in this system. But this glass transition temperature decreases as we turn on the activity, and eventually, beyond a certain value of the activity, there is no. It's always a liquid. There is no glass phase at all. And this, I just want to remind you that this experiment that I told you about, Janus colloids, also see basically some a kind of a phase diagram where it separates the phase boundary separates the glass phase when there is no large-scale motion from a liquid phase. And instead of looking at the temperature, they're looking at the density, the packing fraction. And this axis there is a measure of the activity. So in the activity density plane, again, one has a phase boundary which separates a glass from a liquid. Here we are not changing the density, but we are changing the temperature. And again, one gets basically something that looks like a phase boundary that separates these two phases. So if I now look at, let's say, fixed temperature and increased activity, then one would say an activity-induced transition from melting of the glass to the liquid state. These things were described in our soft matter paper, first paper that we wrote on this. So this is, of course, I mean, simulation, it does give you something that is similar to what one is finding in experiments and so on. But then one wants to understand, for example, I mean, this phase boundary, is it possible to actually get some kind of theory, which will tell you about how the glass transition temperature depends on the strength of the activity. And this is something, I mean, one can do this theory in many different levels. At the very simplest level, one introduces what is known as effective temperature or active temperature. Activity increases the effective temperature of the system by adding to it something which is called an active temperature. And one can sort of justify this by saying, by this simple argument, that if I look at the active force, so active force, I is the particle level, alpha is the component level, and T and T prime are two different temperatures. The way that we implement activity basically means that this correlation function will be, of course, proportional to the square of the strength of the activity, and it falls to 0 over a time scale, which is this persistence time. So this is, of course, not the usual noise that you have in the sort of Langevin kind of description. There you have delta correlated noise, but now we have a noise which has a finite correlation time. But if we say that if you're looking at behavior which is at much longer time scales compared to this tau p, then the first level approximation is to sort of represent this function by a delta function with an appropriate normalization. And that gives you, then if you compare that what you have in the Langevin kind of description, that gives you a temperature. And that temperature I call the active temperature. It depends on the strength of the activity, depends on the persistence time. And then these are parameters in the Langevin equation. Gamma is the friction coefficient, and rho a is a parameter which tells us about which fraction of the particles are active. So this gives you a very simple expression for the temperature in terms of these parameters. And then, of course, you have a usual kinetic temperature associated with the usual thermal noise. And so then one says that there is an effective temperature, which is the sum of these two. And then one says that when this effective temperature reaches a particular value, then the system goes from a glass to a liquid. And that gives you a formula, which is the glass transition temperature when the activity is F0, how it is related to the glass transition temperature when there was zero activity. And that formula gives you this straight line that you see here. And as you can see here, it provides a pretty good description of what is going on. So the simplest level of understanding what is going on is that activity is in some sense increasing the temperature by adding to it something which I call an active temperature, which depends in a specific way on the parameters that you use to model the activity. And this simplest description can be extended. I mean, one can then go to different levels. And one thing that was again in the paper was basically what we are saying now is that the glossy system looks sort of like this, or the dense liquid system looks like this, but each particle is caged by the other particles which happen to be near it. So we say that each particle is in a harmonic potential. And then to that, I write down a Langevin equation for motion of a particle in that harmonic potential. And to that, I add basically a friction term. I add a noise term. This is a thermal noise. So for particles which are not active, you have equation like that. And the particles which are active, they have, in addition to, so this is the force coming from this harmonic potential. This is the friction term, and this is the usual thermal noise. So for B particles also, which are active, we also have the same terms, but then you add to it something which represents the active force. And this term, the corresponding correlation term, will have a relaxation time of a time scale, which is this tau p, the persistence time. So again, you know, this simple description that can be worked out exactly. And then one finds out that there is very similar result that we had discussed in the previous previous slide, that there is a temperature that is coming from this usual Langevin noise. This is the temperature T that comes in here. And then there is active temperature that comes from this psi of T, the active force, which is fluctuating in time, but not delta correlated, but has a correlation time of tau p. And these to add in a particular way that we had just discussed in the previous transparency. And that gives you exactly the same phase diagram as what the simple approximation that I had mentioned earlier that gives. So one has some sort of basic understanding of the effects of activity. So I will also mention something that now we can, the simulation results, we can try to compare with some things that people have seen in biology. And here to do that, one thing that we are looking at here is what is known as an angel plot, which is similar to the plot that I had shown earlier for passive glasses, where one is looking at the relaxation time versus TG's characteristic glass transition divided by the temperature. And here you see then two kinds of behavior. One is a straight line, which represents RNA's behavior, which is called strong glass. And here you see something that has a lot of curvature, which we call fragile glass. So here also in this active glass, we see that this fragility depends very on this activity in a very particular way. That when the activity is very low or activity is zero in the original passive glass, you have fragile glass. But then as you increase the activity goes to zero. This K parameter actually goes to zero. The fragility parameter goes to zero. And then you have this straight line here, which corresponds to RNA's behavior. Now, the question is whether this kind of behavior can be seen in experiments. And after this work was done, actually, then 2017, we came across papers where they show that exactly the same behavior has been found in experiments on the cytoplasm, the bacterial cytoplasm that I had mentioned earlier, where one is plotting here the viscosity, measured viscosity as a function of concentration. So now the thing that is a variable here is the density or the concentration, as I has mentioned earlier. And there one sees rapid growth, which can be fitted to this kind of a Vogel-Flucher kind of formula. And from that, one can extract this fragility parameter. And one finds that for the living system, when the metabolic activities is present, then one finds this nice straight line, which corresponds to a very strong glassy behavior. Whereas as you turn off the activity, then you get this other behavior, different systems, where you have a large curvature. So you have a fragile system here and you have a strong system here. And by changing the amount of activity, you can go from a fragile system to a strong system, which is very similar to what we found here, that here no activity basically gives you a fragile behavior. Then as you increase the activity, then you go from fragile to strong behavior in the glossy liquid system. So although this model, of course, is very, very crude in the sense that we are looking at a very simple model and simple model of activity, some basic features of the dynamics near the glass transition are actually reproduced by this model. Then this is something that this is another paper that we did with Nirgov and Shoroj and others. I will not go into the details of this random first order transition theory that people have developed to describe the behavior of passive supercooled liquids near the glass transition. But what we did was we did some approximate way in which this theory can be modified to take into account the effects of activity. So the formula that we end up with that looks something like this. So this is the part that is coming from activity. As you can see here, there are these two parameters. F0 is the strength of the active force, and tau p is the persistence time. So when F0 is 0, then it just gives you the Vogel-Fulcher behavior. This term is 0, and then it gives you that tau increases exponentially with this quantity E divided by T minus Tk in the exponent. So this will show a divergence of the relaxation time at this temperature Tk, and this gets modified when you have activity. And these are parameters that one can determine from spectroscopic theory, or one can determine from fits to simulation or experimental data. And you see here that this theory provides a very good representation of what we see in the simulation. Simulation also, this is the same angel plot that one gets this very fragile behavior when there is no activity, and then eventually it gets a strong behavior when you increase the strength of the activity. And this symbols at the simulation behavior, and these lines are basically what we get from this theory. And the fragility parameter itself can be calculated from these pictures. And what we see in the theory and what we see in the data almost agree exactly with each other. So this simple modification takes into account the effects of activity. But this, what I want to say is that this kind of behavior that we see here, this good agreement, this does not work so well when the tau p, I mean, all these things that we have just discussed so far were done when this tau p is small. So it's the persistence time is small. As you go to larger tau p, then we'll see that the behavior changes, and this simple theory no longer describes what is actually going on in the active system. So let's just skip a few things. We did another model where it's very similar to what we just talked about, but instead of having spheres, we had dumbbells, which was in some sense a way to model the fact that this bacteria and things like that, one is interested in the context of biology. They are extended objects. They're not spherically symmetric objects. They're cylindrical objects. So we try to see what happens when you change the shape. Nothing much happens. We get pretty much the same kind of behavior, but there is something that I want to point out, which is interesting, that now, sorry, now we are looking at these dumbbells, and we are looking at the dynamics, and this is a movie as time elapses. And you can see here, basically the particles are moving not by, not one particle at a time, but there are these bunches of particles which are moving in the same direction. And of course, I mean, the particles which are moving in this direction, in this part of the picture, they're moving in a different direction in a different part of the picture. So if we look at it, then we'll see that these directions are changing, but there is certainly some correlation, spatial correlation in the velocities of these particles. And this, I want to remind you about some picture that I had shown earlier. This is the experiment on swirling of bacteria. And here you can see that the kind of motion that one is seeing here is actually very similar to what we got in our simulations. So again, these aspects, the fact that there is a length scale associated with the velocity correlation function, all these things can be reproduced now when you have, instead of having spherical particles, you have cylindrical particles, you have rod-like particles, dumbbells. But otherwise, the behavior is similar to what we found for the case of this Cobb-Anderson model, spherical particles. So these are things that we get when the time scale associated with this reorientation of the active force is short. The persistence time is short. And then the last thing that I want to discuss with you today is the behavior that we find. This is our latest paper, came out in 2020, where we are looking at models with very large persistence times. And there we find that the behavior of this active system with large persistence time can lead to phenomena which are quite different from what we found when we are looking at active systems with short persistence time. So earlier, what we were talking about earlier was basically in this regime, where this is the strength of the active force and this is the persistence time. So we are looking at where the persistence time in dimensional units, appropriate dimensional units, was of the order of 10 or even smaller. But then we did simulations for much larger values of this persistence time. And there we found many new things. So I'll like to sort of tell you a little bit about some of these new things that we found. The theoretical description of these new things are still being worked on, and we don't have a very good theory of many of these things. But the behavior that we see in the simulations is actually interesting, and many phenomena that people are interested in the context of jamming or glass transition and things like that can actually be seen in this living system or this active system also. I should mention one thing: these simulations were done for a 2D system and at 0 temperature. So there is no thermal noise in the system, which is also in many of the active systems that one studies in experiments. There is no thermal noise. One changes the density to go from one regime to another. So this was a thermal system and 2-dimensional. And so the model is actually very similar. Since I didn't show this equation of motion, it might be useful to look at it here. This is the sort of equation that one simulates on the computer. One has this friction term, and then one has the interaction term among the different particles, and then one has the active term. Strength is F, and this N is the direction, and this N is the direction in a two dimension is specified by some angle. And this angle basically has this kind of dynamics, purely random dynamics. And so this changes, the direction of the active force changes, and the corresponding time scale associated with that change is basically this tau p. So there is gamma is something that just specifies the medium, and we take basically gamma equals 1, m is equal to 1. So these forces are the forces that is specified in the model, the Leonard-Jones interactions that we are talking about here. And the activity is specified in terms of these two things. One is the strength, and the other is the correlation time. And now we can go, I mean, the new thing is that now we look at very large values of this tau p. And in particular, we look at infinite persistence time. This is the situation where the different particles have this active force acting in different directions. But once a direction is chosen for a particular particle, that direction doesn't change further as a function of time. So it's basically, in addition to the intermolecular forces, interparticle forces, there is this additional force, which is initially chosen in a random direction for each particle. And then that force doesn't change further as time progresses. What we change is that we change this magnitude of the force. So this is the high magnitude, and what we are plotting here is the instantaneous kinetic energy as a function of time. And the kinetic energy fluctuates when this system is liquid, so the velocities change, etc., etc. So this is the standard fluctuations that you see in a liquid. The kinetic energy fluctuates as a function of time. We reduce the value of F. Again, you still have a liquid, so it still is fluctuating as a function of time. But as you go to F, which is below a certain value, which is roughly about 1.6 in this case, then we see that the particles don't move at all. So what one is seeing here, system is athermal. So I mean, one can have a jammed state in which the particles don't move at all. So what we're seeing here is a transition from a liquid state, usual liquid, where the particles are moving around and they have kinetic energy, velocity is changing as a function of time, to a situation where you have basically a jammed state, although you have these active forces acting on the particles. So the system basically goes into an active jammed state. The active jam state is reached if this force is decreased below a critical value. This is shown in this phase diagram again, F versus tau p. One is this at the extreme limit on the right hand side, the infinite tau p limit, in which there is a characteristic value of this F, below which the system, the particles don't move basically. They get into a jam state, whereas as you go across this value, then larger values of F, one has liquid, system has melted, and one has a liquid. So there is a new kind of jamming. And this is something that we are looking at in detail with Bulbul and also Desh to sort of understand whether the jam structures or jammed state that you get in this active system, to what extent they're similar or different from what you see in ordinary jammed system. So there's a new kind of jamming that one finds in these systems. One can look at various properties of the jammed state. I mean, there's one thing that some of you may be familiar with, that in the usual jammed state, there are these force chains along which the interparticle forces are basically concentrated. One basically gets similar kind of behavior here. One is looking at here this jammed state, and one is highlighting the regions where the force is large, and this basically form this kind of a network of chain of force chains. This is similar, but there may be some other. It seems to us that there are some other properties of this jammed state which are different from what you get in ordinary jamming. So that's one limit in this limit. Now we look at situation where this tau p is large, but not infinity, of course. It changes, but changes over a very large time scale. And there we again see something which is a new kind of behavior. And again, what we are doing is we're plotting this kinetic energy as a function of time for different values of this active force. And large values of active force, one is in the liquid state, and one sees the usual. This is something that you have seen in the earlier picture also. But then as you go below, again, some kind of critical value, you see that there are regions or there are time intervals over which the energy is essentially zero. And then suddenly the energy begins to fluctuate. Then again, it goes to zero, again, it begins to fluctuate, and like that. And as you decrease this F, then the interval over which the energy is essentially zero, that increases. And the time interval over which the system is behaving like liquid, energy is, the particles are rearranging, the kinetic energy is non-zero, that becomes shorter and shorter. And eventually below again, some critical value, one doesn't see this bursts at all. So this is basically what I'm doing here. We are coming down in this picture from large values of F to smaller values. So initially you have a liquid. Then what you have here is what we call an intermittent state, where the system has two different kinds of states. One is basically where it's jammed, and when it is basically moving. So it sort of goes back and forth between these two states, and this is what we call intermittent state. And then eventually, as you go to even smaller values of F, then one gets this dynamical arrest state, where the system is not moving at all, at least over the time scales that we have looked at. So here one goes from liquid to jam state. Here for finite but large values of tau p, one goes from liquid to this intermittent state, which is in between, where you have this kind of intermittent dynamics. And then eventually for still smaller values of F, one has this glass, or here now you can call it a glass because, well, I mean, it's still don't have any thermal motion, but as you are, this motion will not be entirely stopped because the active force changes its direction over a very large time scale. So over that time scale, there will still be some motion, but the large scale motion will be arrested. So this, I hope one can see this. I don't know whether how much this movie will play, but this is in the intermittent region. So what we'll eventually be seeing is basically the motion of individual particles. And then this is as a function of time. And what is being plotted here is something like the kinetic energy. So when the particles are moving, then you will see the finite value of the kinetic energy. When the particles are not moving, you'll see a flat line. So let's see how that looks like. It's not so easy to see this events, intermittent events, but you can, if you look at it carefully, then you will see that once in a while you will see this spikes here at the bottom, which basically means that during that time period, particles are moving. And which particles are moving, to see that, you have to basically look at this very carefully, and you will see that here the particles will move in one region, here the particles will move in some other region, and so on and so forth. Each of these spikes correspond to basically what we call plastic yielding, and this plastic yielding appears at different parts of the system at different times. So if one can play that again. So this is the highly intermittent state. I mean, most of the time it is remaining in this state that you see in the static picture. But once in a while, you will see pictures where there will be relatively large displacements, which are again confined in some small region of the system. And then it goes back to this basically static state, and then eventually some other region will yield, and there we'll see some kinetic energy and some motion of the particles. And one can then characterize this state by basically looking at the intervals of between this kind of yielding events and things like that, which is something that we are working on at this point. And why it happens is something that, again, is something that is interesting, but we don't have a real theory. But what one can see is that if the persistence time were infinity, then when the system gets stuck, then it remains stuck. But the persistence time is not infinity, but some large value. Then over a long time scale, the active forces are changing orientation, which allows the system to actually move, so to speak. And then this leads to this plastic yielding events occurring in different parts of the system at different times. The size of these yielding events and the time interval, all these things are interesting, and we are looking at it at this point. So this, I guess, pretty much brings me to the end of the talk. Let me not go into this because already a lot of time has been spent. So this is a summary for the behavior that we see for large values of this persistence time, the behavior that I was talking about earlier. So it has the physics of glass, in the sense that this dynamical arrest, of course, this is something like the glass transition. Jamming is something that we are seeing here in the infinite limit. And then plasticity is something that I just showed you, that there are localized plastic events occurring at different times and at different places in the system. And this turbulence is something that I didn't have time to talk about, but we see that in the regime here. We see that there is something called plastic turbulence here in the liquid. As it is approaching the intermittent phase, then we see some behavior which one sees also in basically fluid turbulence. So this is called active turbulence, and another thing that one needs to understand in more detail. So I hope I have given you a sort of overview of the kind of work that we are doing in this field. There are several things that, the conclusions, but I mean, one doesn't have to go through all of that. Looked at short persistence time and infinite persistence time and intermediate persistence time. One sees new phenomena in all of these regimes. And some of these things, the short persistence time regime, things are more or less understood. But the infinite persistence time, the jamming transition that I showed, that we are working on to understand how that jam state differs from what one has in ordinary jamming. And the intermediate persistence time, there are many things to be done to understand this intermittent behavior, the sort of turbulent behavior that we see, and so on and so forth. So I guess that is where I'll end. I don't know, I probably have taken more time, but thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you. This is really fantastic. I'm sorry about all the crap that happened. And let's open the floor up to some questions.
Can I start with one or two questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is the second model. You have not added a harmonic term. In the first one, you had a harmonic term. So is there any specific reason for that, or?
In the first model, we are looking at single particles. And we are saying that the other particles, which cage this particle, produces a harmonic potential. Whereas in the other models, the interaction is there explicitly. So the first is an approximation where you're looking at basically a caged particle in the cage produced by its neighbors. And there we just call it a harmonic cage. Yeah.
Okay, in the second model, then the interaction, you are taking it as full Lennard-Jones potential.
Yeah. In the simulations, we always do that. Simulation, we always take some simple form of interaction. But then if you want to do some analytic approximation to what is going on in the actual simulation, then one simplest approximation is to take this caging approximation, which makes it a one-body problem, which you can solve exactly. Whereas as soon as you put in the interparticle interactions,
that Fij is for all particles, every particle interacts with every other particle.
No. Fij is still Lennard-Jones. I mean, it's a range.
Okay.
Aniket has a question.
Ask a question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay. So, Chandan, you mentioned about this Marchetti's paper, and you defined this effective temperature in terms of strength of the force. So my question is, if you go back to the root mean square displacement plots that you did, I am wondering then if I rescale the effective temperature, can all those curves be collapsed on a same master plot.
Okay, yeah, we did that. I mean, so if you just give me 10 seconds, and it's probably in this file itself. I can show you that that's what happens. Oh, I'm going in there. No, I don't see it here.
Oops, something happened to the. I don't see your.
Oh, so I'm
no.
probably doing things that I should not
No,
be
no,
doing.
no, no, it's okay, I think.
I don't know. I cannot find it here.
Okay. But it happens.
It happens. I mean, yeah, maybe it is here. No, it's not there. So, I mean, you know, right. So that these parameters F0 and tau p, and they come in a particular combination. So if you keep that combination fixed, but a different F0 and different tau p, then you get the same behavior in the simulation.
Okay. And just one question, other question is that, you know, this person, Nicholas Keller, in California, he works with this bacteriophage in the viral capsids. And then what he did is that he puts the DNA into this confined channel, and he claims that the stalled phase is due to the onset of a glass transition.
Okay.
So
yeah,
my question is that these are all done in the for the bulk system. Now, how the length scale actually come into picture if I put a confining length scale? Okay,
that is a very good question. I mean, this question had been addressed in the context of passive glasses. I mean, you see I mean, you don't have to go to an active system to see the glass transition. You've seen them many times in passive systems, and how that behavior changes under confinement. That there's a lot of work on that. So how the time scale, for example, I mean, if you look at now the time scale as a function of temperature or as a function of density, once you look at the bulk system and then you look at a confined system, how would these two differ? And we ourselves have done some work along those lines, how the glass transition is modified when you have a strong confinement. So one can certainly look at how the active glass transition is modified when you have strong confinement. But I have not seen too much work on it, but that's certainly something that can and should be addressed.
Thank you. It's a beautiful talk. Thank you.
I think Satya has a question.
Yeah. Hi, Chandan. Thank you for a fantastic talk. Really, as usual, great talk. So
thank you.
Now, I just had one question concerning this last thing about the intermediate persistence time regime, where you have the and then you have these periods of the arrested phase, and then I mean, when you look at the E of t versus t, so you have the bursts followed by the long arrest period, right?
Right. So this is this picture you are talking about.
Right, this picture, exactly. So I mean, I was just wondering, what is the sort of distribution of the interval between two successive bursts, for example? Is it exponential?
I would not be able to tell you, because this is something that requires a lot of statistics to measure. Yeah. And although, I mean, we'd eventually like to know this distribution, the form of the distribution right accurately, but we, as far as I know,
I was just wondering
direct measurement of that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that, if it is exponential, that would give another time scale.
Yes.
What would that mean, that time scale? I don't know.
So people have looked at similar behavior. I didn't have time to mention this. So here, what is happening here is that glass is melting because of driving, but driving is at the level of individual particles. Right. So, but the glass can also be melted by driving when you shear it, for example.
Yes.
So to what extent the behavior that we are seeing is similar to shear-induced melting or shear-induced plasticity is an analogy that we'd like to look at in more detail. And there people talk about self-organized criticality and things like that.
Right.
So there are power law distributions.
Right. Yeah,
so
exactly.
that there are power law distributions here or not, that is yet to be confirmed.
Okay. Thank you.
The size of the avalanches, for example, is another thing.
Right.
If you look at that movie, then there are regions where things were moving, and the region has particular size. So how is it? What is the distribution of the sizes?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And there are scaling laws there. By the way, there are two more questions. So Gemunu, and then after that, Arijit.
So my question was, your intermittent state is reminiscent of earthquakes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if the platelets can be thought of as sort of non-active regions, and there are a small number of active regions.
Yes. So it is all sort of driven solid. So I mean, the driven solid shows this intermittent behavior. And the earthquake also is something like that. I mean, the crust is being driven by some forces that are coming from below the crust or something like that.
Right. And is there some kind of a predictor of one of these active regions in the intermittent states?
So this is something that we'd like to, as I said, characterize in more detail. I mean, there are these laws that are there for the magnitude of earthquakes, and also some, time interval between earthquakes, and there's some Gutenberg Richter law or something like that.
Yeah, right. Yes.
And people developed all these models for self-organized criticality with that in mind, that whether one can somehow understand that. Okay. So I mean, if that this intermittency also turns out to be in some sense governed by power laws, then yeah, that could be a model.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chandan, I just wanted to, this is Madan here.
Yes.
Oh, hi, Madan.
Still there. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. I just wanted to comment on Satya's question. It's I mean, at least in the work we did compute the distribution of time intervals between these events, episodic events, and they did have a power law distribution with an exponential cutoff. So I guess that's as far as I can.
I should have mentioned that, but statistics was not great. So I mean,
was not we need to do more. But I understand the direction that Satya's going along. That
So that cutoff that you see, whether it's a system size or whether it's something else, that one has to understand. One has to do it for different system sizes and see whether the power law extends over longer.
Right, absolutely, yeah. Because whether the exponential cutoff comes from system size effects or something.
Satya, your microphone is off.
Thank you, Madan. This is indeed is very similar to all these avalanche models.
Absolutely,
one does see an exponential cutoff, sort of with a power law background behind. I mean, it's quite interesting actually. So
Arijit, do you want to go?
Chananda, thank you for a very nice talk. So maybe I missed something. The very first plot that you have shown in your results. So there, for the force F going to 0, at large times there is an upturn to this MSD plot. So what is that?
Yes. That again, when you see a glass on a computer, the glass remains a glass only over some finite period of time in some sense. If you could simulate it for 10 times longer, then maybe, I mean, I don't know. It depends on the temperature and all those things, depends on the parameters. Over a very large time scale, it may again begin to move. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when you're looking at the end of the plot, there the statistics is not great. I cannot say that, whether, I mean, if I had done the simulation for 10 times longer, then eventually over those long time scales, it would begin to rise or not. But it shows a very long plateau, that is for sure.
Okay, and that kind of an effect does not play a role in this large TP simulations that you have shown here. I mean, those are taken care of, right?
Large TP, the system is eventually, I mean, you're talking about now this, for example, F equals 0.5, right?
Yes.
So whether, if you can do this 100 times longer, then whether you will see some blips there or not, I cannot say for sure. So this is always a problem associated with this kind of freezing kind of phenomena, that simulations, of course, are restricted to very short times, but I mean, even experiments are restricted to some time scale. So if you could go to time scales which are much longer, whether the system will eventually show some dynamics or not, that nobody can tell.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Any further questions? this really was a great talk, and thank you all for being patient and putting up with all the crap that happened. I actually changed the settings, but I don't think it made a difference because the settings were changed after the talk began. And I didn't want to change the whole idea of the talk because that would have put a lot of people out in the cold if they didn't see the email right away. So we took a measured risk. The only thing that happened was that Neil Gove, I didn't recognize who he was, so I took him out. And then I sent an apology email to him, so I'll send him the recording. Okay. But I didn't know him, so that's my bad. But
so this in between things that no, random things, they will also come in the recording, I suppose.
No, I'll be able to edit it up. I'll try to do what I can to become the movie director here.
Trump was listening to you talk.
Yes.
Yes, Trump and all his friends. I can talk about this in an academic setting nicely. Unfortunately, my mouth is completely muzzled when I'm at work because in government there is something called the Hatch Act, which prevents me from talking anything remotely political.
I see.
But yeah, this is refreshing to.
No, I heard about this problem with Zoom earlier, that security was not very good and people could sort of.
Yeah, actually, you can really upgrade the security, and I have not really done it because we have not had a problem. I've maintained a low level of security primarily because there are students and friends of students who join, and it's always nice to welcome them in a discussion which is small and informal, because the largest group sizes we have had is about 50. So it is not a very big, big attendance event. But what happened today was that the actual number of people present was 31. And then 5 people suddenly came in. So by the time I noticed that 5 people had come in, the problem had already begun. So it was a very orchestrated attack. And so I'll have to do a few changes to make sure that we don't have this kind of adventure again.
And I think it has something to do with India because somebody was saying Hindi mein bataiye or some such thing like that.
Right. No, yeah, this was an Indian attack, but how I don't know. I don't know if any of you know how this is typically done. If there is a playbook, so that it'll be good to know. But somebody who got in.
Yeah, actually, I have never seen this before. I mean, the first time I'm seeing this.
Same here. I have never seen it. I've heard about it, but it was a good Saturday morning adventure.
Yeah, new experience.
New experience. All right. Thank you so much. It's really lovely to see so many of you. And
thank you very much.
A beautiful talk. I wish I could really listen more attentively than I could this time, but I'm going to be watching the video many times.
Yeah, if you have any question, I mean, after watching the video, then you can always let me know.
Absolutely. And thank you again.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for arranging this. Bye-bye.
Bye.